All right, so now that we've converted our user profile page and friend detail page over to load data from the server, the next thing that we're going to see how to do is convert our context providers over to load their data from the server. So remember that the data inside our friends provider and favorites provider is used across several different components. So essentially what we're going to do is have these provider components load their data as soon as they're rendered. Right? This will have the nice effect of basically having that data in our application until the user refreshes the page or closes the tab and reopens it, etc. Now this is a little different than our pages that we've created, because our pages, basically this use effect hook here that we implemented will be called whenever we come to this page, whether we've already loaded data on this page or whether it's the first time that we're visiting this page. So essentially having our data loaded inside providers like this does tend to give the impression of a little bit more performance, because all of our data is loaded at the first moment when the user visits our site, and as they navigate around our site, they're really just looking at data that's already loaded, instead of having to load that data every time they visit a different page. Okay, so anyway, let's take a look at how to convert over our friends provider and favorites provider components to load their data from the server. Let's start off with our favorites provider, since this one will be a little bit easier to start with. So first of all, we're going to get rid of our local storage code here, since again, we're not going to be storing any of our state in local storage anymore. So we'll get rid of that. We're going to leave favorites IDs. The difference here is that we're going to be loading that from the server. So we'll set the initial value of that to an empty array. You can also set it to null if you want, but for resources that are an array, I usually like to set that default value as an array. It just makes it a little easier. Okay, and for our use effect hook, we're going to basically remove this local storage thing here, and we're going to change this over to actually load our data for us. So this is going to look just like it did in our pages that we converted. We're going to start off by importing Axios from Axios. And inside here, we're going to define an asynchronous function, which we'll call load favorites equals async. Inside this function is where we're going to make our request to the favorites endpoint by saying const response equals axios.get, and we of course need to say await axios.get since it's asynchronous. And the URL here is going to just be /favorites. Okay? And then we simply need to set our favorite IDs to the IDs that we get in this response. So we can say set favorite IDs response.data. Okay, and we're also probably going to want to have a loading variable as well. So we'll say const is loading and set is loading equals use state, and it will be true initially, actually. There we go. And then we'll set is loading to false down here once we've loaded our favorites. Okay, so now all we need to do is load our favorites here, and that should be all we need to do. One other thing, though, is that we actually do need to make this isLoading variable available to the components that need it, right? And the way that we can do that is by going down here and adding it to our value object that we're passing to our favorites context.provider. So that'll look like this. We'll just say is loading, and that will make it available if a page needs to display a loading message or something like that. Okay, and one other thing that we're going to do is we're going to just remove this logic from toggle favorite for now and do the same kind of thing that we did before. We're going to say alert not implemented yet, just so we don't get confused and think that we're toggling favorites on the server when we're actually still toggling them in memory. So we're just going to replace this all with an alert for now. And that should be all we really need to do for our favorites provider. So let's go into our friends provider and do basically the same thing. We're going to get rid of the existing state and the starter friends. Okay, so we'll get rid of those. We'll be getting all of that data from the server. And our initial state for our friends is going to be an empty array. We'll also just jump ahead and add an isLoading state variable to our friends provider here. So we'll say isLoading, set isLoading. Initial state for that, you know by now, will be true. And then we're going to use this use effect here, as our loading point. So we're going to say const. We'll call this load friends equals async. And we'll call this function like that. Okay, so inside here, same drill. We're going to say const response equals axios, which was just imported for me automatically by my IDE, equals axios.get. That is await as well. And we're going to say slash friends, and that will load all of our friends for us. Okay, and then we just need to set our friends to response.data, and set is loading to false. All right, and then just like we did in our favorites provider, we're going to stub out these two methods here, add friend and update friend. We're going to say alert not implemented yet, and alert not implemented yet here as well. Okay, we might be reusing some of this logic, which is why I'm commenting this out instead of just deleting it, but that'll be something for later. So we'll say not implemented yet. Okay, and we'll also add a function while we're at it for removing friends, because that's something we're going to want to do later on as well. So we'll say const remove friend equals, this will probably take the friend ID that we want to remove, and we'll say alert not implemented yet here as well. All right, so again, we're already passing our friends to the value of this provider. We need to also pass is loading, so we'll add that over here. And while we're at it, we'll just pass this remove friend thing as well. We'll say remove friend, and let's put is loading back here at the beginning, just to keep things organized a little bit. All right, and that should be all we really need to do for our friends provider, right? It should be successfully loading our friends from the server when we first load our app. So the next thing that we're going to do is we need to find where the contexts for these two providers are actually being used, right? What pages they're being used in. So we'll just do a quick search for friends context, see where that's being used. Here. In fact, we can just say use context, friends context, and see where that is. So it looks like we have 3 pages where that's being used. So what we're going to do here is we need to also get is loading. So we'll say is loading, and we'll just display a loading message if this is still loading the data from our context. So we'll say is loading and display a loading message. If it is, we'll say loading. Otherwise, we'll display the regular DOM. Next up, we're going to do our friends page. We want to do the same thing here. Now, in our friends page, we're going to have both of our favorites context and friends contexts loading their data from the server at the same time. And they both provide an is loading property with the same name. So we're actually going to have to rename this property to is loading favorites. And we're going to rename this one here to is loading friends. Okay, that's just how you rename things using object destructuring syntax if you're not familiar with it. And what we're going to do is just create a new is loading variable that combines these two, right? We won't want to display the actual friends page until both our friends and our favorites are loaded. So we'll just say is loading equals is loading favorites or is loading friends. Okay, so it'll be true if either of these is true. And then we'll go down here, and we can either use a ternary operator, or we can just say if is loading, return paragraph loading. Okay? And the last page that we're going to have to convert over now is our new friend page. This one is only using the add friend function here, so we don't actually need to do anything there. Awesome, so let's head over to our application in the browser now and see if everything's working like it should be. All right, so it looks like our friends list page is working, right? It seems to be loading all of the friends from the server. And if we click on any of these, it's also loading its data. And likewise, if we go to the edit info, right, that seems to be working as well. Now, we can't add any of our friends to our favorites yet to see if that actually works, but what you can do is inspect the network and make sure that you got all of the data that you were looking for. So if we take a look here at favorites, we can see that that just sent back an empty array. If we take a look at friends, we can see that that sent back all of our friends. And that's really all we needed to do inside our providers. So our app now is loading all of its data from the server. So it's technically, from that standpoint, it is a full stack app, even though we're not doing things like adding to favorites or, allowing ourselves to edit people's information, add new friends. We'll get to all of that stuff later. But I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.